Good morning. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning for our conversation with Douglas London on his book, The Recruiter: Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence. We appreciate your attention today. It is a very important issue we're going to discuss. As many of our participants know, we at the Center have been focusing over the last several years on a number of national security issues wrapped under the great powers competition umbrella. Discussion of intelligence collection, processing, and use in the policymaking process has been a very important part of that conversation. And we're pleased to continue our focus on that issue area because in order for us to succeed in modern great powers competition, we will need to be able to rely and depend on effective intelligence. But the game is changing. There is a technological element which is rapidly advancing. That's not really new to the world of spycraft, but there is a constant dynamic and challenge around the use of technology and the reliance on human intelligence and the development of American skill sets there. We have a deep respect at CSPC for those who are intelligence community practitioners. It is difficult work. It is work that can be dangerous. It is work for which our professionals oftentimes can expect to receive no credit for the great works they do and the risks they take. And yet the failures are always plastered on the headlines and leave us just trying to understand the complexities of the challenge of intelligence collection. So we're excited to have Douglas London with us this morning to talk about his book and his perspective on some of these broad questions. Joshua Huminski will moderate the conversation and then accept your questions. So as they occur to you, please submit them via the Q&A. Thanks, Douglas. At this point, I'll turn it over to Joshua to take us from here. Joshua.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Mr. London, thank you so much for joining us today for a very timely conversation. It is not like there's not much to be discussing in terms of the world of intelligence, from Director Burns' recent announcements of the mission centers to the top secret cable about the agent losses. And so we have a lot to discuss today, but I really wanted to start off and give you a chance to sort of set the scene for your book. What brought you to write this book now? And kind of what's the message that you're looking for readers to take away from that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on this webinar. It's a real privilege. The Center does great work, and I've followed it for quite some time. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my book, but really in the context of the conversation, I was hoping it would promote. I retired in 2019, and it was a time where we were really immersed in a great deal of politicalization, weaponization of intelligence, and of the CIA in particular. And retiring in that atmosphere, which contributed to my choice at the time to leave the CIA, gave me an opportunity to reflect and determine that, as bad as it had become, it didn't start with the election of Donald Trump, though he took a lot of steps that I thought made things worse, particularly when he appointed Richard Grinnell as acting DNI and then John Ratcliffe as DNI, who functioned more as political operatives than what the role of the DNI was supposed to be, as I thought Senator Coates did brilliantly, as did General Clapper before him. When I reflected, I think it started off with something really odd and corny, and I talk about this in my book, just the whole idea of how do people react to the term spy and spying, and it had taken on such a negative connotation. And you and I were just talking before the program started about John le Carré and spy novels and such like that, how the idea that there was a nobility in spying, of doing it for God and country, so to speak, and what that all meant, where it had become so perverse in a way. And stepping back, I first thought, I wanted to write about some of the things that were near and deep to my heart, what I had seen, and this evolution, particularly that took place post 9/11 for the CIA. And of course, my view is going to be very CIA-centric, though I dealt with the entirety of the intelligence community, and of course, as an executive agency, with the executive, with Congress, providing readouts, particularly on covert action issues and such like that, and found that taking sort of that broad look, the agency had found itself on a path that was not where it was meant to be. And in that post 9/11 seeing itself vulnerable, I think, at the time to an existential threat, people were demanding accountability for 9/11. And I suppose it's easiest to point your fingers at a secret organization that can only do so much to speak publicly to what it's done. And the agency was not guilt free, obviously, in 9/11. I think while the agency certainly did a fair deal of appropriate reporting, trying to warn, as the 9/11 Commission said, the blinking red lights to get attention of decision makers that something evil this way was coming. Unfortunately, we were still very turf conscious and heavy on compartmentation to the exclusion of working with our other U.S. government agency partners. And I think that really was the biggest lesson for the CIA at the time about sharing and working in a team concept, which I think has changed dramatically over the years with the fusion centers, the mission centers that now exist throughout CIA. But as I examined what had happened to us, I found that the CIA was so, in fact, in a panic to survive, it leveraged what was unique about it, which is covert action. I mean, the authorities that give CIA covert action, and though technically the president can assign covert action to any agency, it's historically always been the CIA because just of its composition, its makeup, its agility, its flatter management, and the limited bureaucratic requirements on procurement, spending money, pivoting to issues and such. And it's a civilian organization at the end of the day, which in itself was deliberate to try to give this organization a central look at the intelligence world and a more objective look. It wasn't a policymaker, so it wouldn't be grading its own homework. So in theory, it didn't have to worry about saying, my baby's not ugly. The agency leveraged covert action beyond the balance, I believe, that its charter calls for. It's primarily mission to do foreign intelligence collection, analysis, and covert action. But covert action should be something particularly selective. It shouldn't be, we call them the CIA because it's the easy button. We don't call them the CIA because it maybe has gotten better and more efficient at certain TTPs, practices, if you would, because of its size and ability to align resources. And a lot of what CIA had been doing, I found post 9/11, was problem solving with combatants on the battlefield in South Asia and the Middle East, who the FBI couldn't prosecute, and the military could not accept, as it had traditionally accepted, prisoners of war, because these were not sovereign nations that we were fighting against, but a transnational organization. I think it went on a slippery slope in terms of the enhanced interrogation program, which I don't think any case officer, any real spy worth his or her salt would ever condone, because the idea of coercion, the agency has never embraced, and not simply from a moral perspective, though morality certainly plays a role when you're conducting what is easily interpreted as an unethical practice, but in the most ethical manners. But coercion just isn't efficient. And I think we found that in practice, and the reporting would bear out. Yet, unfortunately, this move towards covert action and paramilitary and kinetic activity was something that the agency got really good at. And when you get really good at it, it becomes easy to press that button because you know you've developed that proficiency. And we nurtured a completely different atmosphere and culture in the agency over the 20 years. We sort of moved away from this very civilian manner that we had. I would speak to the most senior officers from the time I was a junior officer in first name because we were spies. And now it was all yes sir, chief this, chief that. And in fact, the senior leadership was beginning to become more compartmented itself from the greater workforce, where leaders were surrounding themselves with entourages who were there really to facilitate what they had predetermined. That change, I think, hurt the agency in terms of diversity, being a more inclusive organization, being able to innovate and create. And then as people who profited from this career moved up the ranks, they tended to recycle themselves in their proteges who maintained that posture. I found the CIA coming to a crossroads, and here we are today with great power competition, where there are choices the agency can make to not only get back on course, but to leverage what are its strengths, which tends to be its people, which tends to be people who are representative of our country and the world, because God love the United States. We have the gifts of people of all nationalities, at birth, of ethnicities, languages, skin color, gender, lifestyle, that can be more effective overseas in stealing secrets, which is really what the agency has to get back to as we look at strategic competition. We look at Russia and China and Iran, North Korea, and even our allies, sometimes allies, who are competitors often for influence and security and economic prosperity. I think the agency has an opportunity to do just that. I've been very encouraged by the actions that I've seen publicly reflected by Ambassador Burns, who I had the privilege to work with years ago on a Libya issue, on a sensitive issue of Libya, with David Cohen, who I worked with before when he was deputy director, and with Dave Marlowe, the new chief of the clandestine service, who I think calling him a throwback is unfair, but calling him a throwback to the values and traditions that I grew up with in the first 17 plus years of my career, that we were a spy service and we were a service committed to our workforce, but also the agents who provide secrets. And hopefully we get into more about that human aspect as we go through the conversation today and solicit some questions from listeners.
That's absolutely fascinating. It serves as a great segue because it's one of the things I really wanted to pick up on that I particularly enjoyed in your book was the the sort of the peeling behind the curtain of what it is to be an operations officer and how much the agent is a central feature. Because I think a lot of, as we were discussing before, a lot of the books that are out there today, the very popular books, the so-called spy fiction that's out there, is it's a one man, one woman army who's kicking down doors, can jump out of a plane, fly the helicopter, do everything. And the way that you approach it is it's a real thing. I mean, I'm remarking on your unfortunate last parachute jump as being an example of that. It's not quite the paramilitary officer, but if you could just kind of give a sort of brief overview, kind of what it is to be an operations officer, because you talk so richly about it. It's one of the most things I enjoyed about the book. If you can just kind of start off as there, would be a great point to talk about that point.
I appreciate the opportunity to do so because one of the things I've always missed in spy genre, fiction or non-fiction alike, is not just a lack of reality. Because sometimes those things are fun. Watching a James Bond movie, so you could suspend reality. But it's the intimacy. It's what makes human intelligence operations so unique and so valuable to decision makers as we try to inform their decision making on the most consequential issues for United States security. And in as much as I had to take great care to protect sources and methods as well, and work closely with the agency and its publication review board, which was sort of an up and down experience at times, I felt what I didn't have to peel away was the bond, was that unique connection between agent and case officer that must evolve, which also speaks to the myths about coercion or throwing just money at greedy people who are doing things for the most mercenary reasons. And I'm not saying there's not agents who do that, but those generally are not necessarily your best agents. There's a partnership that has to exist between the case officer and the agent because you're both taking significant risks. The agent more so and more often than you are because that agent is living at least a double life in seclusion, in loneliness. Who can the agency tell and trust? So the case officer becomes father confessor, becomes imam, priest, rabbi, in that the agent is comfortable sharing what's really inside their heart and their mind. The case officer, mind you, is leveraging that, manipulating that, because the recruitment of an agent isn't a one-time thing and then everything's on remote pilot. It's constant. Case officers are constantly evaluating, assessing their assets, re-recruiting them to determine, has their life changed? Have their circumstances changed? Has something gone wrong, either personally, professionally, or perhaps they've been turned? Every time you meet an agent, especially a sensitive one, a high-risk one, you're meeting them after a period of time they've been back in the lion's den, whether it literally is they've been in a dangerous counter-terrorist environment or in the halls of the SVR or the FSB in Moscow. And there's always that risk that something could change, that they could be compromised, or they could just have a revelation, or the reasons they spied in the first place have themselves changed. And then in turn, the case officer taking the risk by the requirement to meet them clandestinely, which means it's got to be hidden, it's got to be concealed. And if no one sees it, that means the case officer is taking some risk in the conduct. And they're likewise always vulnerable to ambush, whether arrest or worse. So what I wanted to do was tell my story of the CIA's path post 9/11 and pre 9/11 to where we are today, because if my focus was on the agency was at a crossroads, I wanted the reader to understand what that crossroads entailed and what the stakes were. Human intelligence is distinct from the other insights. I believe there are six, as I teach in my class. Signals collection, open source, imagery, materials, and resources and such like that, because it provides context. There is actually occasions where different people listen to a signals cut, basically one from a telephone call, an eavesdropping operation, if you would, to make it simple, or some other worded collection, and they come up with different meanings because they're translating words. When you have an agent in touch with the players, the pivotal players in whom you're reporting, or the agent is one of those players, you get more about what was this about? What was the meaning of what was said? What are the real intentions and aspirations here? Because intelligence reporting and raw reporting from human services is always in past tense. It's what someone or some group planned to do at a given time, which is subject to change. But at that time, that sort of moment in history, you know exactly what was in their mind and what their intention was. That's an extraordinary capacity of insight that you don't get from satellites and drones that take pictures or listen to people.
That intimacy, I think, was particularly poignant in the book because you have stories which I also found refreshing that are not successes. Some of the memoirs that are out there from former officers from all the services paint themselves as these amazing lights. Like, yes, I recruited this person, that person, and well, you talk about some of the stories that were not successful. One of the ones that sticks out in my mind was the diplomat who you ended up inviting over to meet your family. And I was curious, I love that story just because I have dogs, but I'll turn it over to you because I'd really love for the audience to hear that story and kind of an unsuccessful attempt at recruiting an agent.
So case officers are real people, spies are real people. They have lives. Agents are real people. They have lives. They have families. They have kids, cats, dogs, hamsters, gerbils, whatever like that. And they're living themselves a double life because the case officer has to maintain this veneer, which is deliberate in terms of what their pattern is like, what their routine is like, how they portray themselves as a person to the outside world because they're trying to operate in the shadows. Generally, is that you don't want to become noticed, you don't want to become the center of attention, and it is within that environment that you create that you spy, that you recruit, and you handle agents in a clandestine manner. And doing that with kids goes along to territory. So one of my children, particularly my second youngest daughter, for whatever reason, is probably a bigger CI threat at times than the Russians or the Chinese had been to me over my career. Very curious, very always thought actually that I was a spy from the time she was 6 or 7, and God knows only how. But we were having an event at the house, and it was in a somewhat austere location. And places like that are great to kind of invite people to events where there's social opportunities, there's movies, there's films, there's food, there's camaraderie that they can't otherwise get in somewhat challenging circumstances. And this particular country had its issues, including a high crime, and so folks were generally at home at night, or other diplomats and officials had some sort of protective detail. And one of the individuals I was targeting, he was among our list, and I was just in a chat with him along with a couple of other people. And there were kids at this event because you brought your kids, give them a chance to interact and mingle. And my daughter was great at working a social event. In fact, when I taught at the farm, I would bring my students early on in the course to a little social event at our house, and I'd say, watch my daughter. Watch how she tries to put you at ease, to make you appear to the center of attention, to disarm you, and to seek your background and your views on things. She does it like breathing. We try to teach it. She just like was born with it. So we're chatting, and she gets in the little circle, my cute little daughter, and we're talking about, oh yeah, it's difficult, the crime out there, and this was a target speaking to that. And my daughter pipes up. She goes, my daddy's so considerate because he'll go do the food shopping at night. He'll wait till the lights are out, and he'll put on his backpack, which is where he puts his groceries, and go out the back door so he doesn't disturb us. And that was pretty much the end of that developmental effort with my contact. But that's part of it as well. And to be fair, case officers going to leverage their family, leverage their kids. Use children's and family events to do just what I had done. But when you're faced with not only making sure there's nothing available for when the local service breaks into your house, but also your child, that sort of makes it a little more complicated in terms of your thinking.
It's incredibly fascinating because that's the first time I think that I've read in any depth about the challenges of being an officer overseas and having kids. It's alluded to in other books, but that's one of the things I think that I enjoyed most about The Recruiter was just the full scope of how you write about the life of an operations officer and use that as a vehicle to talk about the transformations. And I want to get to that specifically. Um, as the course of your career progressed, you were throughout the world in multiple different capacities. The post 9/11 environment, everything shifted, at least at a very surface level, to counterterrorism, and we became very good at the finding, fixing, finishing, exploiting process. I mean, General Stanley McChrystal, I think one time called JSOC the Amazon of killing, for example. And I'm curious if you can talk to that transformation for sort of the immediate aftermath of 9/11 to where we are with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and what you saw over that 20-year transformation.
It's easy right now to have 2020 hindsight when I try to think back about what it was like on September 12th. And in September 12th, there was a clear state of panic. And in the CIA, I don't mean that, oh my God, people are reckless and stumbling about and such like that, but panic at the certainty that there were going to be other attacks. And there were going to be other attacks. And we foiled and disrupted so many of them, including potentially catastrophic ones. But at the time, all we knew was something else was coming, more was coming, and Al Qaeda particularly had a modus operandi of never letting go of things they tried. So what we knew of the aviation plot, obviously from the 90s, was the centerpiece of 9/11, and there were other plots that we were tracking that they had considered over time that we were desperate to preempt. So we went and sort of flipped ourselves over in terms of what our primary mission was. It's we sit back now, 20 years later, and go, terrorism is not an existential threat, and perhaps we overreacted, and perhaps we made some of our challenges and threats worse by the overreaction and by our focus on find, fix, finish, and I speak to that in my book because I was part of it, but I can stand now and go, we made some mistakes there, and we paid a price for it that we're going to need to make some serious investments on now and in the near, medium, and long term future. But that desperation turned CIA and much of the IC into a counter-terrorist organization. That's what we did. It was all about making sure nothing else grand would happen again. And politically, it's easy to understand that when you think about how this impacted day-to-day lives of every American. I mean, go to an airport, go to a concert, go to any event, and your life is now shaped by this specter of you can go food shopping and be killed by a terrorist. Now, the odds are real low, obviously, right? But just that reality to anyone, anywhere, at any time is terrifying, and it's easy to manipulate and leverage. And I think, as unfortunately politicians do and tend to do. So while we were doing that, we were basically minimizing our investment in traditional foreign intelligence and minimizing our focus on nurturing careers. My first 17 plus years of the agency, and as I moved into management, there was always a genuine consideration of nurturing a career in any form in the agency, analyst, case officer, targeting officer, whatever, like giving them experiences. But since all these experiences were now focused on find, fix, finish, counterterrorism, on kinetic activity, we were also missing the opportunity to grow the officers who we would need to lead as they moved up the ranks. And they lacked a lot of the traditional opportunities and they lacked the counterintelligence exposure they would need. Meantime, our adversaries, our rivals, our competitors were getting better. The agency was losing a step. And you mentioned it, the amazing impact of technology. And as much as I recognize and acknowledge that, as a spy in chaos, there's opportunity. That's clearly the way I and my colleagues have always looked at it. So things that can hurt you can also help you. It depends on how you leverage them. We've not been without such challenges before. You look historically at the 80s, where moving from the 1970s to the 1980s, spy handling in critically denied areas such as Moscow or Beijing changed dramatically and changed because we innovated, we took risks. People forget that we were facing spy dust, tracking dogs, microwave bombardment then, which might be a contributing player in the Havana syndrome has always existed. How do we overcome the technology even then at the time? Because even then, call analysis, link analysis, the technology and the human factors were to play. We started meeting our most sensitive agents in Moscow. The billion-dollar spy, Tokachev, spent at least a couple of dozen times. That was revolutionary. Oh my God, the idea that you would take a risk and putting a US spy in personal contact with a deep, sensitive Soviet agent, unthought of. Brush passes were like an amazing innovation to get around, the challenges of impersonal communications. So what the agency needs is that ability to once again innovate, but the agency needs to be able to take risk. And that's going to be about leadership, giving them enough room to make some mistakes, to take some risk, because we've lost a fair bit of that over the years. I'm still confident the agency, the CIA, is the best intelligence service in the world. If you just take a look at it broadly, what it brings and the talent of its workforce. But if we take a very, look for the easy button, look for a modular solution, let's look at what we do now and maybe add a layer. We're at a stage where we have to be able to go back to the drawing board, allow our people to go back to the drawing board. I saw this in covert communications over the years. Consistently, the CIA was always, oh my God, we need to improve our covert communications, often mostly electronic, with our agents so we could be able to handle the challenges of today and technology and meeting people in person, either to recruit them or once we recruited them. But it was often such pressure on those people in the programs that they felt the safest ways to go were maybe tinker with it as opposed to scrap and start again. We need a willingness to do that, and we need leadership to do that. And I'm hopeful that the current leadership at CIA, in the IC, at ODNI, and at the White House will provide for some tolerance, and that the public confidence in the agency will allow that as well.
You brought up a number of topics I definitely want to dive into here, but one of the questions that just came through is a nice pivot point. How does tradecraft have to change when we live in this sort of digital or all digitally surveilled world? Mark Polymeropoulos, who was on a previous event with us, recently wrote in the Washington Examiner, said that we can still meet with agents anywhere in the world whenever we want. To your point about even meeting in hostile denied areas like Moscow. But as we start to see these things come together, where the Moscow metro system is now using facial recognition for fares, the airports in China are using facial recognition to direct you to your flight. How convenient! We saw an early example of this in the UAE with the Israeli operation against the Hamas individual that was unpacked in a matter of hours, all because of hotel footage. What are the challenges of tradecraft in this new digital era, and what would you see as needs to change in addition to the risk tolerance that you referenced before?
Those challenges are all valid and that we've been dealing with for a number of years. And again, we have evolved our tradecraft to bear in mind the threats of tracking and technical tracking and what that means. Mark's right, we still do, and we still must be able to meet agents wherever. The challenges today are a bit different. As I said, the challenges that we found in the 80s and the 90s and immediately post 9/11. We need to make those investments, but it means taking a look at what our book is, not going, this is what we've always done, so this is what we're always going to do. It's maybe being somewhat revolutionary. So the ability to meet with an agent, even for a brief period of time, does a great deal to your ability to validate the information, have certainty, and stand behind the reporting, because that's what it's all about. That's what's unique, again, about human reporting, that we can give you context and we can give the consumer a degree of confidence, high, low, or medium, in that source's reporting, to at least allow them to factor it into their assessment and their analysis when they come up with finished pieces for decision makers. I believe that there's a risk of hubris sometimes in the agency, and I think it's possible with any bureaucratic organization where you start um, being less concerned about the threats from certain players. Oh, they're a developing country, or they're a backwater, or they're this. The playing field is different, and the rules are different. I'm glad you mentioned that, because the rules with which we deal these days, the US can no longer impose those rules. We can no longer impose the world order which we want to see. Russia and China and Iran, they're doing things that defy convention. They're pressing that envelope to measures just short of war, which sometimes can also inflict casualties as much as a war can, that they can leverage with anything from disinformation, political meddling, to cyber attacks, as we see. The latest cyber attack today from the Russian External Service, the SVR. So, how we answer that has to be a recognition that the smallest non state criminal organization can be a significant threat. They can recruit agents, they can leverage cyber, they can hack. So, our tradecraft has to be on its best across the board against all adversaries, against all competitors, even against our friends, to be able to make sure that we're getting the insight we need so that there's no surprises. A lot of it is going to be attitude, I really believe. Again, I'm confident, as Mark is, that we can do it, but I have been worried that that sense of hubris, that lack of senior leaders who grow up in traditional espionage, who are now making resource decisions, making yes or no approvals for certain risky operations. But as long as we move from a risk calculus that's political to a risk calculus that's operational, then the right people will be making right decisions. And I think it might take some time, but the agency itself is certainly capable of doing it.
I want to tie two threads there that you raised, because we talk about the investment in technology and tradecraft, and also the protection of agents and assets. The New York Times reported probably about a week ago, I think, on a top secret cable that had gone out to all stations about the worrying and alarming loss of agents and recruited assets. I recognize, obviously, we can't speak in an open forum on this, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because it raises a number of questions. Is it a potential technology failure? I think Foreign Policy had an article about the roll-up of several networks within China in 2014. We go look back at the Ames and Hansen cases of potential moles and breaches within the intelligence community. I'm curious, at a very macro level, what your thoughts are and reflections on sort of that article in and of itself and what it potentially means going forward.
Yeah, that article is troubling, and I regret being quoted in it, to be honest, because I didn't want there to be an appearance that I was endorsing leakers, which I think is the most dangerous thing to do. I argue in my book, and I speak publicly to the need for internally the IC, the agency specifically, to be accountable. When I talk about accountability, I don't talk about airing your dirty laundry in such a way that you're actually impairing that organization's ability to address shortcomings, address mistakes. But internally, as an operations officer, one believes and subscribes to, you should be the first one to identify and acknowledge your weaknesses and warts. That's how you keep operations safe, and that's how you learn. That's how you learn from mistakes. The agency is uniquely capable of pivoting quickly. It doesn't have the same bureaucratic requirements that the Department of Defense does. I mean, for the DoD to buy anything is just ridiculous. I remember being exposed to it a few years ago when I was in a liaison capacity for our counterterror center with their special ops people to deconflict the special things we both did. And for them to buy a new piece of equipment, to realign resources, to pivot, takes years, and it's required. And I think a lot of that is congressionally mandated and politically motivated. Where CIA, I mean, we could buy things from abroad, we could buy foreign-made goods. We need to be respectful of the rules, and we're audited, and we have just the same level, if not more, of oversight, but we're able to move quickly when we could make the case for it. So as we look today to the demands, I think it requires us to take on that creative. Let's find our mistakes and our vulnerabilities first. What I had challenges with over the post 9/11 period was we had nurtured a different type of leader in the CIA, and we had nurtured a leadership culture over those years where it's circle the wagons, protect your own. Sometimes internally, even hide behind sources and methods. I'm not talking about exposing to the public, but even within the CIA, we couldn't talk about certain mistakes because, they were too sensitive. Well, if the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians already figured it out, don't you think the other ops officers should know about it so that we don't make the same mistakes? And there was such a concern about people taking blame and people protecting their own and protecting their proteges, and so much. We got away from what was at our core, our credibility, our integrity. And I think we saw that in some of the finished intelligence and the weaponization of intelligence that we saw from the 2002 National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq, that the Bush White House leveraged, to even what the Obama White House, the Trump White House, they all leveraged to address their political needs, to find a way to cherry pick, spin, or at least pressure the intelligence community to get behind them. We do our best when we're the first ones to say, we screwed up. And if it was operational error, there's a lot of factors you can't control, and you've got to have some room for that. But if it was malfeasance, if it was hubris, if it was an unwillingness to listen to alternatives, if it was worse than that, we're going to crush any exposure and have a cover up, dare I say, to protect the seniors involved and then promote them into other key positions. That's what I'm speaking to. Certainly not the idea of leaking. I like to think that as I see Ambassador Burns appointing a very talented officer to be head of the Havana Syndrome Task Force, to make the new DDO someone who's one of the first people to look at what did we do wrong, and not assign blame, but to listen and hear things out and make course corrections. We're at least moving in the right path. And I think the fact that I've seen publicly, we've moved a lot of those seniors who I was most concerned about, who I speak of to some extent in the book, at least, that sort of cult of personality, that can only make things better, but it's not going to happen overnight, and it needs to be positively reinforced. Officers need to be able to know that they shouldn't self-censor themselves because they're worried about ticking somebody off or getting somebody in trouble or saying something out of the box. Do it respectfully, but challenge convention. Don't be a conformist, and we'll be the spy service we need to be.
Building off of that, you speak to in the books of the organizational adaptability and growth and creating a culture, as you just said, of being able to recognize the mistakes of the past, but also be willing to examine them and adapt to them and act upon them. And I'm curious, one of the questions that came through from the audience was, as we look to the post 9/11 era, the post involvement in Afghanistan, are there lessons from the counterterrorism fight, perhaps the asymmetry of it, that could be useful and adapted to fighting peer competitors, particularly on the intelligence battlefield?
We certainly developed a whole lot of tools and a lot of practices. The tools probably will lend themselves better than the practices. There's a different tradecraft. We like to say there isn't, but there's essentially different conditions that affect the tradecraft in a conflict zone. When you've got your collectors sitting behind big walls because they can't get out on the street to understand what's going on in their world, to understand the environment, to better protect their agents, you're losing to a great degree. So those TTPs, ideally, we're not going to bring forward. The tools, yes, but I think what particularly happened for the agency, and I think U.S. policy in terms of counterterrorism, was we made our strategy one that depended on tactical capacity, tactical successes. As you said at the outset of the program, we got really good at find, fix, finish, amazingly good. The tools, the people, all would converge to such an amazing granularity that it really did become the easy button. But those metrics about attrition and combatants killed or captured on the battlefield didn't solve the problem in counterterrorism, didn't win the war in Afghanistan. And I believe that over-reliance on tactics, because they work, they make for good metrics, they make for good feedback to Congress, to the White House, they look like success, but they're really not, fail to understand the need to address conditions. The U.S. needed a better strategy in Afghanistan. The U.S. needs a better strategy for counterterrorism. I take the position that this focus on South Asia, this focus on destroying al-Qaeda, while very effective against attriting al-Qaeda, didn't destroy it, and also distracted us from the rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria and its effect worldwide, on what was going on in Libya, on what was going on in northwest Syria, in Yemen. And we suffer from that because the CIA is great tactically, but the CIA needs to follow whatever the strategy is we're pursuing nationally, but itself needs to be the one informed decision makers to go, yeah, we could do these great things, but here's what you're going to pay. Here's the consequences of second and third order effect. So I don't necessarily think the lessons learned will be what went right, certainly on how to use technology, how to link human with the technology, which we did extremely well, but to look better at how do we deal with any national security challenge strategically and then build and align the tactics to fit that. Certainly those are going to be the issues for us against in the world of strategic competition, as we look for, first and foremost, how do we gain insight? And that's what is the most important thing. How do we understand what the threat is, what it means for us? We're not going to be able to kill our way or simply use force. But I also think, in terms of a strategy for great power competition, we need to get away from a very symmetrical approach to our risk. We see cyber threats, we see election meddling, and the United States impulses to retaliate symmetrically, to meet force with force, to meet meddling with meddling, to meet cyber with cyber. That's not today's great power competition landscape, where if you really want to maintain insight, keep your competitors and rivals concerned that their actions will have consequences, it means doing so in a non symmetrical way, where we operate in the shadows, where, yeah, there's an understanding by Russia that if they conduct a cyber attack, maybe Putin's going to lose $1 billion in the money he has in Geneva. That, if done in the shadows and done asymmetrically, will be more potent in warding off some of these threats than just doing something where it's going to be tit for tat. We draw down their embassies, they draw down our embassies, they hit us cyber, we hit them cyber, and it causes a spiral. That's the beauty of the shadows of the intelligence world. We have those capacities. We just need to have an understanding of how better to apply them.
I'm glad that you brought up Russia in particular and the asymmetrical nature of things, because one of the conversations we had with Mark before was talking about the anomalous health incidents and how that seemed to be a fundamental changing of the rules by possibly Russia, possibly somebody else, where during the Cold War, there was a unwritten understanding between the KGB and CIA that officers, families, diplomats, by and large, were off limits from physical harm. And what Mark had said was that, in his view, that means that Russia's understanding of the playing field has fundamentally changed, that Russia is on a war footing, believing that they are under attack from the West through various measures of hybrid warfare. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that asymmetrical relationship. Does the United States fail to realize it as in a war, in inverted commas, with Russia? Has Russia changed the rules of the game, and do we need to adapt accordingly? Not going kinetic, obviously. But what is your take on that dynamic right now?
There's a mixed bag in what Mark has to say. I agree, as I said earlier, that Russia is no longer respecting those rules, such as that reciprocity. But Russia's respect for rules and disrespect for rules is based on consequences. I don't necessarily believe Russia is on a different footing today. If you look from a Russian perspective, it's very Russian. What they're doing with compensating for weakness by changing the level of the playing field. Russia is in many ways a declining world power. It can't match the United States toe for toe. In fact, it's in a more inferior position to the United States today than it does during the Soviet Union's grandeur as a Warsaw Pact empire. So what the Russians are doing, or what the Russians have always been doing, how can they apply capabilities and advantages to offset United States strengths? They do that particularly well because, one, they do tend to be very asymmetrical. They use information warfare. The General Gerasimov doctrine, which we read about, I think, in 2013, about all measures short of war to change the landscape. There's certainly a new development in that, but it's applying a lot of old Russian tricks and ploys that autocratic societies have used for centuries. The Chinese are applying them as well. Again, we speak of Iran and to some extent North Korea. So that means if the Russians don't see consequences, they'll push the envelope. If they don't see a risk. Now, I again, to Mark's point and to my point, I don't think that should be symmetrical. Symmetrical might get you more of a spiral of escalation. But in the old days, Mark's right. In the old days, if they beat up a CIA officer, the FBI would beat up an FBI officer. It wasn't a gentleman's agreement. It was, what are the consequences? Russia has not faced consequences. Russia has not faced consequences with its cyber meddling, with its election interference. The sanctions, that only strengthens Putin's hands in a lot of ways. He uses that domestically, he uses that internationally. And with oil prices going back up again, he's going to be okay. How can we provide consequences for Russia concerning cyber, concerning meddling? How can we provide consequences for Iran concerning its axis of resistance, its terrorism, support of Hezbollah, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, what it's doing in Syria. Consequences need to be there, but they need to be there in a thoughtful way that if we do this, it's not going to make things worse. I am confident the United States has those capabilities, certainly can breed them, but it needs to be this very strategic approach to things and an understanding of what consequences can we leverage that leverage our strengths and attack the weaknesses of our adversaries. We've not done that. We've not been doing that. We used to do that more in the Cold War, vis-a-vis the Russians and the Chinese. I think we need to get back at that again.
Pivoting to China specifically, one of the programs we've been running at the center is an exploration of the geotechnology and the differing models of sort of authoritarian capitalism and sort of Western liberal approaches to things. And you mentioned at the end there about sort of the asymmetric approaches to China's interests globally and regionally. And I'm curious if you were to take a white sheet, a white paper document, and offer up recommendations on how the United States can push back against Beijing and its activities globally in that world of asymmetry and in that world of the shadows from intelligence, what would you outline as your sort of top three priorities as it relates to China?
Even not being a Chinese expert, but certainly having worked at Target, I would say be careful on how you assess China. It's easy to get lost in its incredible development of tools and technology and its ability to project power through an increasingly blue water navy, where we've always depended on uh, neutralizing disadvantages in numbers, perhaps, of China by superior technology and superior strategy. All that said, China lacks agility. China, in my mind, as a spy, as I see it, is growing increasingly powerful, but doesn't maneuver particularly well. It gets very fixated on strategies. It's using its Belt and Road Initiative to increase its influence abroad, but the Belt and Road Initiative has certain disadvantages that are inherent in the Chinese economic policy and Chinese technology to apply to the workspace and in its manipulation of loans and finances and workforces and such like that. There's vulnerabilities there that the United States could exploit. China, at the end of the day, it's not a democratic country, but it has embarked on this odd experiment of capitalism with communist political policy that grows expectations of a very large population. One of the reasons why China needs to keep expanding its economy at a far greater growth rate than the United States does, or most of the industrial nation, to offset the sacrifices the Chinese population makes on democracy and human rights and such like that. There's weaknesses there we can manipulate without this idea that, okay, we have to have as many ships and such like that. We have to have a more sophisticated and capable military capacity to offset China's threat to us in the Pacific and the South China Seas and its threat to partners and allies, Australia, India, and such like that. We need to do that in balance with seeing China for what it is and what it truly represents. And what are its aspirations? What does it intend to do? What does it seek to take away from the United States? But China today is a much more confident country to do these things. We need to understand where their weaknesses are. There are weaknesses there. I think a lot of that issue is going to be addressed by good intelligence, which we have the capacity, again, I think, to get moving forward.
One of the questions that came through is how do groups like Bellingcat and citizen-led open source intelligence organizations change the calculus for the CIA, but the U.S. intelligence community writ large? There's obviously the Open Source Center, and there's been sort of the pulling in of those open source capabilities. But how does that change the dynamic, or does it?
I think most importantly, it's a recognition that your foreign adversaries, your state actors, are not your only threat. As they expose our rivals and our adversaries, they often can likewise be a threat to us. I think it's a good wake up call, and I think sometimes they, because they're independent or private sector or NGOs, have a freedom to innovate that we are more restrained to as a bureaucracy. Open source is the wave of the future. The amount of not only information, but also the offensive capacity to leverage biometrics, to leverage technology for sabotage or offensive operations. I think it's an area where we need to be careful in moving forward, but we can't be slow and restrained. Artificial intelligence is an amazing tool, but at what points do we lose that safety net where if one mistake is made because of how something is programmed, it sets off a chain reaction of dominoes, which leads us down a line where we're going to make a terrible error. The ability to manage and manipulate open source and artificial intelligence is, I think, one of the greatest challenges of current times. Autocracies are going to move a lot quicker because they're less worried about laws and regulations and how their people are going to react. The United States, as an open society, needs to move with the confidence of the people. And I think that's where the DNI gets involved in being that, if you would, conduit between what we're doing in secret and what we're doing to assure the public that it's in their best interest. But getting our hands around that is going to be key. I think we have the capacity technically, but do we work together, US agencies, in synergy and in synergy with the political aspects and the public to get their confidence? So when things go off the rails, there's not been this sinister plan to spy on Americans and how we've done them wrong. It'll be a delicate balance.
We have a few more minutes here, and there's some questions from the audience that I want to get to. But if we were to appoint you as director of CIA, starting tomorrow, replacing Director Burns, what would your top three priorities be to reform the agency and get it to the place that you think and see as it needing to be in terms of strategic competition?
Besides changing the cafeteria, the director's greatest leverage comes from the director's relationship with the president. The director is no longer the president's principal intelligence advisor, that's DNI, but the director has a granular insight into intelligence and operations, be they human or technical or what have you, that far exceeds the DNI because the director is living there every day. The director is getting briefings, has the ability to task and find out what's going on. So making sure that the Ambassador Burns makes the most of that relationship with the president, with the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, as well as the other key players among the principals, which namely would be the Defense Secretary, Secretary of State, but not just them alone. And I know actually Ambassador Burns is very good at that, and he's you trust Ambassador Burns because he speaks with credibility. I think it means investing in the workforce and making sure that we understand the agency has to reflect our needs. It has to be heavy on diversity, not because it's politically the right thing to do or it seems the right thing to do, but America's strength is its diversity and always has been in bringing the gifts of people. It's making sure our hiring practices change somewhat, that we're not just hiring and please forgive me, but the people who come from a much more privileged suburban lifestyle, but people who have to deal with adversity, who you want to be the ones on the streets dealing with today's biggest challenges, dealing with today's biggest threats. I'm not talking about hiring criminals, for God's sake, but I'm talking about hiring people who may have gone to community college, who may not speak the King's English, but make for good spies or make for good analysts because they understand needs, they understand certain parts of the world. They may be naturalized or first generation Americans that still have such a tie and connection, but we're so worried about, counterintelligence, are they vulnerable? Are they vulnerable to manipulation by a foreign power there? It's making sure that we have that diversity and that inclusion. And it makes sure that when we then pull the thread on inclusion, it means that we are serious about speaking truth to power. Know the truth and it shall set ye free. It's on our wall. That means that people are comfortable in a respectful way, not to self-censor, that leadership has engagement and exposure across the workforce, not just to their principal lieutenants and other general flag rank senior intelligence officers, but hear out things that may be a little unconventional, but are worth exhausting to see, are we otherwise missing something? We teach that to our analysts, alternative analysis, challenge your key assumptions, challenge your principles. We've not been doing that operationally. So relationship with the president, the workforce that we're hiring, and this greater improvement of the climate that allows for challenges, respectful, sometimes taking the machine apart to start all over again, that's what I think would be the first three things I would focus on. And then the cafeteria would be the fourth one, and parking would be the fifth.
We have a few more minutes, and I want to ask one final question before turning it over to Glenn. We started out before everybody joined into the room, talking about sort of spy fiction and John le Carre. I'm curious, in terms of the books that you've read, what you think is your personal favorite uh, spy fiction book, but then also separate from that, or possibly it could be the same book. What do you think is the most accurate reflection of the life of an operations officer?
Wow. Okay.
Fiction.
They'll get me in trouble. So fiction, and I would say probably one of the earlier books I read, Agents of Innocence by David Ignatius. I love that book. It's the first book I gave to my children when I came out, right? And when I had to tell them what I dad really did for a living. It's not just the tradecraft. I think in that very first book, he captures a lot of the feelings. There's some dramatization, but it's sort of based on a real story, and it's based on a real person who was a fabulous case officer in his day, Robert Ames. In terms of nonfiction, this is awful and it sounds biased, but really my book. I've not seen anything that captures the intimate relationship between case officer and agent that isn't all about just projecting, oh, I'm a badass and I'm a cool guy and I carry around an M4 and I get shot at. Yeah, I got shot at occasionally and I got missiled occasionally, but that was, not my job. My job was to avoid being seen or detected. My job was to get off the X when I was at risk, not to fight my way out of it because I'm a spy. Yeah, I was a Marine. The Marines taught me to fight, but my job was about not having to pull that pistol out of my hip because once I did, it means I probably did something wrong or I came into circumstances I couldn't control. I kind of think my book does a better job at that. That likewise tells you, yeah, James Bond repelling out of helicopters, well, that's super cool. But what's super cool is changing history. And when you've done espionage, right, as we've seen so many times, you literally change history. One human being on the street collecting secrets from one agent, Cuban Missile Crisis, our opening to China in the 70s. Those were monumental historic events that were done by a person at a time by being stealthy.
What would be your guilty pleasure spy fiction read?
Well, it's not the read. I love James Bond movies. They're just a lot of fun. Daniel Craig's my favorite because he's got emotions. He's a real breathing person. Sean Connery I thought was the coolest. But I just read Damascus Station and I did a review of it. I thought that was a great job by David McCloskey. I tease him because I am a tradecraft diva, but he deliberately had to leave out good tradecraft, so I give him an out for that. But I thought he did a nice job. That's the latest thing I've read, and I'd recommend it.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. London. The book is The Recruiter, Spying in a Lost Art of American Intelligence. I highly recommend everybody pick it up. It is on bookshelves now. And Mr. London, thank you so very much. And over to you, Glenn.
Yeah, Doug, just wanted to add my thanks. Very interesting conversation today, and I also appreciated the discussion on sort of the personal elements and the reflection in pop culture about the work. I always lamented as a former foreign service officer the fact that our work was just rarely depicted at all, and I was hoping for any depiction, whether realistic or not, so people could. There's a few, but not very many, and they're usually kind of on the dramatic side, but at least people got a sense of sort of what we did. On the personal side, I served in as a State Department USAID guy in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Balkans, the Middle East, and was sort of confronted. I'm sure I was a suspected intelligence officer in every position by adversaries, and I was a suspected intelligence officer by most of my friends and family. Just given the nature of where I went, I constantly confronted this question: which agency did you really work for? And I came to answer that question by saying the following: I really think you need to de-emphasize that the incessant focus on which agency. We have great people working overseas in various agencies doing important jobs, and it's really not so vital for us to decide who's working for what. We're all working on the same broad team. Yes, we use different methods, but we're working towards the same goal. And I really think it was important for people to understand that aside from the extra dangers taken on by folks that were in the military or the intelligence agencies, which differentiated their risk profile from mine, the work was all pulling in the same direction. And I worked with some great colleagues across multiple agencies and appreciate that experience. So I wanted to say thanks to you for your service, and for those like you who do a lot with no credit. We appreciate how much they contribute to our security. And thanks to you also for your intellectual work in helping us understand, by writing this book, better the nuances and the questions around what we in Washington need to think about regarding intelligence capabilities and how much it matters. So, Douglas, thank you so much for being with us today. And Joshua, great job on the moderation. To our participants, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you all very soon. Take care. Bye bye.
It's been a pleasure.